It showed three figures in a garden: a tall man, a young woman, and a boy in a wheelchair. Around them, flowers bloomed in vibrant colors. At the bottom, in careful letters, he'd written, "My family." The artwork would hang in the center's main lobby, a testament to what was possible when people truly saw each other. Later, as families toured the new facility, Amara found herself alone with Maxwell and Ethan in the garden, modeled after the one where they'd first met face to face. "What do you think, Ethan?" Amara asked. "Did we do okay?" He typed quickly. "Better than okay." "Perfect." Maxwell placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The foundation board wants to expand already. 3 more centers in other states." "One step at a time," Amara laughed. "Let's get this one running smoothly first." As the sun set over the garden, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the 3 of them sat in comfortable silence. They weren't related by blood, didn't share a last name, came from entirely different worlds. Yet somehow, against all odds, they'd become a family. Ethan pressed a button on his device, the computerized voice speaking the words he couldn't say but deeply felt. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Amara smiled through tears, remembering that first day, feeding a silent boy while his father watched from afar. None of them could have imagined where that simple act of kindness would lead, to healing, to purpose, to connection, to home. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in, taking their seats beneath the banner that read Blackwood Johnson Care Center, Grand Opening. 3 years had passed since that life-changing day when Amara had first stepped into Ethan's room at Oak Ridge Care Center. Now, at 22, she stood backstage in her graduation cap and gown, peeking through the curtains. Her mother sat in the front row, cancer-free for 18 months, chatting with some of the nurses she befriended during her recovery. "Nervous?" Maxwell asked, appearing beside her in a perfectly tailored suit. "A little," Amara admitted. "I didn't expect so many people." Word spreads when something genuinely good happens. He handed her a small gift box. "This came in this morning. I thought you might want it for today." Inside was a delicate silver pin shaped like 2 hands reaching toward each other. Engraved on the back were the words, "Dignity in Care, AG Method." "It's beautiful," she whispered, pinning it to her gown. "Your research paper deserves recognition," Maxwell said. 3 medical journals have already requested follow-up studies. Amara's paper on cognitive engagement therapies, developed during her work with Ethan, had caught the attention of specialists across the country. What had begun as intuitive compassion had evolved into a groundbreaking approach to neurological care. "Is Ethan ready?" she asked, changing the subject. Despite her accomplishments, she remained uncomfortable with praise. "See for yourself." Amara peeked into the side room where Ethan, now 20, sat in his customized wheelchair. He was carefully going through his tablet, reviewing the images he wanted to show during the presentation. His blue eyes, once vacant, now focused intently on the screen. "Hey you," she said, entering the room, "looking sharp." Ethan looked up, his face lighting with a smile. Though still limited, his expressions had become more pronounced over the years. He typed on his tablet, and the computerized voice spoke, "You look beautiful. Proud of you." His communication device had been Maxwell's and Amara's joint project, designed specifically for Ethan's needs, but now being adapted for others with similar conditions. "I'm proud of you too," she said, straightening his tie. "Ready to show everyone your artwork?" He nodded, pressing another button. "Nervous, many people." "Me too. But we'll do it together, okay?" Another nod. The outdoor stage manager poked his head in. 5 minutes, Ms. Johnson." As Amara stepped onto the stage minutes later, the crowd applauded. She could hardly believe this moment, addressing medical professionals, families, and community members as a newly graduated nurse practitioner with a published research paper and a care center named partly after her. 3 years ago, she began, "I was a nursing student about to drop out of school because I couldn't afford tuition. I took a job feeding a young man with a neurodegenerative disorder." She paused, looking at Ethan in the wings. "That young man changed my life as much as I supposedly changed his." She spoke about dignity in healthcare, about seeing patients as people first, about the healing power of genuine connection. As she talked, she saw Maxwell slip into the seat beside her mother, the 2 of them exchanging a warm greeting. Today, we're opening a center that will provide care based on these principles to families regardless of income, she continued. The Blackwood Johnson Scholarship Program will also train nurses in these methods, creating a new generation of caregivers who understand that medicine without humanity is simply not enough. When she finished, Maxwell joined her on stage for the ribbon cutting. But first, he stepped up to the microphone. 3 years ago, I was a very different man, he said, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. Wealth had isolated me. Grief had hardened me. I'd lost faith in humanity. He glanced at Amara. Then I watched through a camera as a young woman fed my disabled son the kindness I'd forgotten existed. Murmurs rippled through the audience. That moment changed everything for Ethan, for me, for countless others who will benefit from this center. Maxwell's normally composed face showed rare emotion. I thought I was helping her when I offered financial support. In reality, she restored something I'd lost, my humanity. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience when Ethan joined them on stage. With Maxwell's steadying hand on one side and Amara's on the other, he pressed a button on his tablet, showing his artwork on the huge screen behind them, a painting he'd created over 6 months with painstaking effort. Before she could respond, a nurse appeared at the door. Ms. Johnson, Ethan is asking for you both. He seems excited about something. They found Ethan in his room, pointing urgently at his communication board. What is it, buddy? Amara asked, kneeling beside him. With painstaking effort, Ethan touched 3 symbols. Family. Together. Happy. Amara and Maxwell exchanged glances, both moved by the simple, profound message. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of how far they'd all come and how much further they could go together. The guest house on the Blackwood estate was bigger than any home Amara had ever lived in. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating hardwood floors and tasteful furniture that someone had selected with care. Are you sure this is all for us? Her mother asked, running her hand along the kitchen counter. After 3 rounds of the new treatment Maxwell had arranged, some color had returned to her cheeks. That's what Mr. Blackwood said, Amara replied, still amazed herself. It had been 6 months since she'd accepted his offer, and sometimes she still couldn't believe how much had changed. The main house stood a short walk away across manicured lawns. It was there, in a specially designed suite of rooms, that Ethan now received his care under Amara's supervision. I'm headed over now, Amara said, gathering her books. I have an hour with Ethan before my online class. The path to the main house was lined with flowering bushes. Amara had helped Ethan plant some of them 3 months ago, part of the therapy program she'd designed with his doctors. Getting his hands in the soil had sparked something in him, a connection to the physical world that had been missing. Inside, she found Ethan in his therapy room, working with Dr. Patel, the speech therapist. Good morning, Amara called. Ethan's head turned toward her voice, his eyes lighting up with recognition. Dr. Patel smiled. He's been waiting for you. We've made excellent progress today. On the table lay a communication board, pictures and words Ethan could point to. His movement was still limited, but improving weekly. Show Amara what you learned, Dr. Patel encouraged. Slowly, with tremendous effort, Ethan moved his hand to touch 3 pictures in sequence. I feel happy. Tears sprang to Amara's eyes. 6 months ago, the doctors had said he might never communicate meaningfully again. That's amazing, Ethan. She squeezed his shoulder gently. I'm happy too. After Dr. Patel left, Amara helped Ethan with his lunch, a task that had once been a struggle but now flowed with easy routine. His coordination had improved enough that he could guide the spoon part of the weight of his mouth if she helped steady his hand. Your dad's coming home today, she reminded him. He cut his business trip short to be back for your therapy assessment tomorrow. The changes in Maxwell had been almost as remarkable as those in his son. The cold, distant businessman had slowly transformed over the months. He'd rearranged his schedule to be home more often. He'd started joining them for Ethan's therapy sessions, hanging on every word from the specialists, asking questions, taking notes. One evening, Amara had found him in Ethan's room, awkwardly reading a novel aloud, the same one she'd been reading to Ethan the week before. He likes the voices you do for the characters, Maxwell had explained, slightly embarrassed. I'm trying to learn. Now, as Amara helped Ethan into the garden for their afternoon session, she spotted Maxwell's car coming up the driveway. "Look who's early," she said. Maxwell emerged from the car, shedding his suit jacket in the warm sunshine. He waved when he saw them and headed over. "How's the patient today?" he asked, crouching beside Ethan's wheelchair. "Show your dad what you learned," Amara encouraged. Ethan reached for his communication board and touched the symbols. "I missed you." Maxwell's face transformed. The stern businessman disappeared, replaced by simply a father, eyes shining with joy and pride. "I missed you too, son." His voice was husky with emotion. Later, after Ethan had rested, Amara found Maxwell in his study, reviewing papers from her latest college courses, part of the specialized program he'd arranged for her. "You're doing exceptionally well," he noted, looking up as she entered. "Top marks in neurological care." "It helps to have real-world application," she said, sitting across from him. "The professors are impressed with the therapy program we've developed for Ethan." Maxwell set the papers down. "I've been thinking. The methods you've created for Ethan could help others." "What do you mean?" "A care center. Not like the facility where I found you, something different. Focused on dignity and individual needs. Using your approaches." His eyes held an intensity she recognized, the look he got when forming a new business plan. "We could help families who can't afford specialized care." "We?" Amara asked, surprised. "Your methods, my resources." He smiled slightly. "A partnership." Her heart jumped. He spoke. Not exactly. But he had a picture book in his room. He kept pointing to the letter A, then to the garden. "The nurse called me." It's the first time he's tried to communicate his wants since the accident. Tears pricked at Amara's eyes. "Thank you for telling me." Walking out of the gleaming tower into the bright spring day, Amara felt like she was dreaming. The weight that had been crushing her for months had lifted slightly, making room for something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The sleek glass building downtown looked like it was made entirely of sky. Amara checked the address on her phone again, wondering if there had been some mistake. The text message had been brief. "Mr. Blackwood would like to meet at Blackwood Tower, Monday, 10 a.m. That was 3 days after their garden encounter. She hadn't seen Maxwell since, though she continued caring for Ethan as usual. "Can I help you?" asked the receptionist at the front desk, her eyes taking in Amara's simple dress and worn shoes. "I have an appointment with Mr. Blackwood." The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Your name?" "Amara Johnson." After a phone call and a visitor badge, Amara was directed to the elevator. "Top floor," the receptionist said. "His assistant will meet you." The elevator rose smoothly, each floor making Amara's stomach flutter more. What could the billionaire possibly want? Was he unhappy with her care of Ethan? Was she being fired for taking him outside? On the top floor, a woman in a crisp suit greeted her. "Ms. Johnson, this way, please." She led Amara through an open workspace where people typed furiously on computers or spoke in hushed tones on phones. At the end of the room stood a glass door leading to a large corner office. Maxwell Blackwood stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city below. He turned when she entered. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please sit." Amara perched on the edge of the seat, her hands folded in her lap. "If this is about taking Ethan to the garden, I did have permission from Dr. Chen." "This isn't about the garden." Maxwell sat across from her. "Though I should thank you for that. The night after your outing, Ethan slept through the entire night. First time in months." "Oh, that's good." Maxwell studied her for a moment, then opened a folder on his desk. "I know about your situation, Ms. Johnson." Amara tensed. "My situation?" "Your mother's cancer diagnosis. Stage 3, with recent metastasis to the lymph nodes. The experimental treatment her insurance denied. Your student loans. The eviction notice." Her cheeks burned. "You investigated me." "Yes." That's an invasion of privacy." "It is," he agreed, surprising her. "But I needed to understand why you're different from the others." "Different how?" "Every other person who's cared for my son since the accident has treated him as a task to be completed. You treat him like a person." His voice softened slightly. "Like he matters." "He does matter," Amara said firmly. Maxwell nodded once. I have a proposal for you. He slid a document across the desk. Amara glanced at it, seeing figures that made her eyes widen. A full scholarship to complete your nursing degree. Specialized training in neurological care. A position as Ethan's primary caregiver with a salary 3 times what you're currently making. And coverage of your mother's medical expenses, including the treatment her insurance denied. Amara looked up, certain she'd misheard. Why would you do this? I'm a businessman, Miss Johnson. I recognize exceptional talent when I see it. He leaned forward. What you've done for my son in 2 months, teams of specialists couldn't accomplish in 2 years. I just treated him like a human being. Exactly. Something like pain flickered across his face. After we lost his mother, after I almost lost him too, I've been so focused on medical solutions that I forgot about the human element. Amara looked down at the papers, overwhelmed. This seems like charity. It's not charity, it's an investment. Maxwell's voice was firm. There's one more aspect to consider. This would require you and your mother to relocate to the private wing of the Blackwood estate, where Ethan would receive home care under your supervision. Amara blinked. You want us to move in with you? The estate has a separate guest house. Complete privacy. But yes, you would live on the grounds to provide consistent care for Ethan. Her mind raced. The offer would solve all her family's problems at once. Her mother would get the treatment she needed. Amara could finish her degree. They wouldn't be evicted. But, this is a lot to take in, she said finally. Of course, take time to consider. Visit the estate with your mother this weekend. See the facilities. He handed her a business card. My private number. Call with your decision by Monday. As Amara stood to leave, still dazed, Maxwell added, One more thing, Miss Johnson. She turned back. Ethan asked for you yesterday. To her surprise, Maxwell nodded. You're right. He turned to look directly at her. I've watched you feed my son, read to him, talk to him when you thought no one was listening. I've seen you stay hours after your shift ended. Amara glanced at Ethan, who was watching them both with unusual intensity. He's worth it, she said simply. Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, the barest softening around his mouth. He looked at his son, then back to Amara. I believe we have things to discuss, Miss Johnson, about Ethan's future care, and perhaps yours as well. The spring sun warmed the care center's garden as Amara wheeled Ethan along the stone path. After nearly 2 months of daily care, she'd finally gotten permission to take him outside. The doctors had been hesitant. Ethan hadn't left his room in almost 6 months, but Amara had insisted the fresh air would do him good. Look at those birds building a nest. She pointed to a maple tree where 2 robins worked. They've been at it all week. Yesterday the male brought a piece of blue string. Now it's hanging from the side like a little flag. Ethan's eyes followed her gesture. The sunlight brought out gold flecks in his blue eyes, something Amara had never noticed in the artificial lighting of his room. She parked his wheelchair beside a bench near the small pond. Is this good? Not too sunny? She adjusted his hat, making sure he was comfortable. The ducks usually come around this time. They're not afraid of people at all, probably because everyone feeds them. As if on cue, a mother duck and 5 ducklings waddled toward them from the water's edge. See? They're saying hello. For a moment, she thought she saw Ethan's lips twitch upward. Neither of them noticed the black luxury car pulling into the private entrance, nor the tall man who stepped out, straightening his expensive suit jacket. Maxwell Blackwood rarely visited the care center during daylight hours. His last few visits had been late at night, when he could slip in unnoticed to sit with his sleeping son. Being recognized in public usually meant unwanted attention, business proposals, or pitying looks when people connected him to the tragic accident that had taken his wife and left his son in this condition. The center's director hurried to greet him. Mr. Blackwood, we weren't expecting you today. Where's my son? Maxwell asked, ignoring the pleasantries. He should be in his room. He's not. I checked the cameras before arriving. The director paled. Let me find out immediately. Before she could call anyone, Maxwell spotted them through the glass doors leading to the garden, a young woman and a boy in a wheelchair by the pond. Never mind, he said, already walking toward the doors. Outside, Amara was telling Ethan about the nursing classes she had to drop. but it's just temporary. I'll get back on track next semester somehow." She smiled, though her eyes held worry. "Anyway, ducks don't care about nursing degrees, do they?" "Ms. Johnson." The deep voice startled her. She turned to find a tall man in a suit standing behind them. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. "Yes," she replied, automatically moving to stand between the stranger and Ethan. "I'm Maxwell Blackwood, Ethan's father." Amara's eyes widened. She'd never met the elusive billionaire, though his name appeared throughout Ethan's file. The staff spoke of him in hushed tones, the demanding father who funded the entire private wing but never visited during normal hours. "Mr. Blackwood," she managed, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you." He shook it briefly, his eyes moving to his son. "Why is he outside?" "The doctors approved it," she said quickly. "I thought the fresh air and change of environment would be good for him. We've only been out here 20 minutes, and I've been monitoring his responses carefully." Maxwell studied his son, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders, the alert look in his eyes as he watched the ducks. "Has he shown any distress?" Maxwell asked, his tone softening slightly. "None at all. If anything, he seems more engaged than usual." Maxwell nodded once, then sat on the bench near Ethan's wheelchair. After a moment's hesitation, Amara sat too, leaving space between them. "You've been caring for my son for 8 weeks now," Maxwell said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir." "The longest any nurse has stayed with him since the accident." Amara wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. "I've been watching you," Maxwell said after a long pause. "Excuse me." "There are cameras in Ethan's room, for his safety." Amara felt her cheeks flush with both embarrassment and indignation. "You've been spying on us." "Monitoring my son's care. After what happened with previous caregivers, I needed to be certain." Amara wanted to be angry, but something in the man's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the hint of vulnerability beneath his controlled expression, made her pause. This was a father who had lost his wife and nearly lost his son. Trust wouldn't come easily to him. "I understand wanting to protect him," she said finally. "But people need privacy, Mr. Blackwood. Even Ethan." For the first time in years, Maxwell Blackwood made a decision not based on cold logic or business acumen, but on something he'd almost forgotten: basic human connection. He picked up his phone. "Thomas, prepare the car. I'm visiting the care center tomorrow." The hospital hallway felt too bright, too sterile as Amara sat beside her mother. The doctor had just left after delivering news that made the floor seem to drop away beneath them. The cancer had spread. They needed to try a more aggressive treatment, one their insurance would only partially cover. "We'll figure it out," Amara said, squeezing her mother's thin hand. "Maybe I can pick up extra weekend shifts." Her mother shook her head. "You're already working too much. Your studies." "Can wait," Amara cut in. "You can't." Later that night, Amara sat at their kitchen table, calculator in hand, bills spread before her like a losing hand of cards. The numbers wouldn't add up, no matter how many times she tried. Between the new treatment costs, next semester's tuition payment, and their overdue rent, something had to give. The next morning, with dark circles under her eyes, Amara arrived at Ethan's room with her usual smile in place. "Good morning. I brought a new playlist today. Some classical stuff my mom likes. She says Bach is good for the brain." As she went through Ethan's morning routine, her phone buzzed repeatedly in her pocket. She ignored it until Ethan was settled with his breakfast, then stepped into the bathroom to check the messages. 3 missed calls from her landlord. 1 text, "Final notice. Payment due by Friday or eviction proceedings begin Monday." Amara leaned against the sink, breathing deeply to steady herself. Friday was 4 days away. She had maybe half of what they needed. Her last credit card was maxed out from her mother's medications. She splashed cold water on her face and returned to Ethan with a bright expression. "Sorry about that. Where were we?" In his office, Maxwell frowned as he watched the exchange. He'd seen Amara step away, seen the moment of panic cross her face before she composed herself. Something was wrong. That afternoon, Amara sat with her academic advisor at the community college. "I need to drop these courses," she said, sliding a form across the desk. "I can't manage the full schedule right now." The advisor frowned. Amara, you're one of our best students. These are core requirements for your nursing degree. I know. I'll take them next semester, if there was a next semester. That will delay your graduation by at least 6 months. Amara nodded, the weight of the decision sitting heavy on her shoulders. I don't have a choice. That evening, she returned to the care center for her shift, unaware that her conversation with the advisor had sent up red flags in Maxwell's investigation. He'd tasked his head of security with a background check on Amara 2 weeks earlier, and a report had just landed on his desk. Inside Ethan's room, Amara was setting up for their evening routine when her phone rang. Seeing it was the hospital, she answered quickly. Hello. Yes, this is she. Her voice dropped. What do you mean the insurance denied it? The doctor said. She paused, listening. But we need that treatment. There has to be something. She glanced over and saw Ethan watching her, his blue eyes tracking her movements. I understand. I'll figure something out. Thank you. Ending the call, she slumped into the chair beside Ethan's bed, momentarily forgetting he was there. The weight of everything, her mother's worsening condition, the looming eviction, her derailed education, crashed down on her at once. A single tear slid down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. Sorry about that, she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. Grown-up stuff, nothing fun. She reached for the book they'd been reading, but paused when she felt something touch her hand. Ethan's fingers had moved, just slightly, toward hers on the bed rail. The gesture was so small, so unexpected that Amara froze. According to his file, Ethan rarely initiated any physical contact. Thank you, she whispered, genuinely touched by his attempt to comfort her. You're a good friend, Ethan. In his office, Maxwell sat perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. On his desk lay the comprehensive background report on Amara Johnson. Her mother's medical records, their financial situation, her academic transcripts, her volunteer work at free clinics, the eviction notice, all of it laid bare. He had started the investigation looking for red flags, for any reason to be suspicious of the young woman caring for his son. Instead, he'd found an extraordinary person crushed under the weight of circumstances beyond her control. The report included photographs. Amara at a community fundraiser for cancer research. Amara helping elderly residents at a nursing home during her clinical rotation. Amara tutoring younger students in science. Maxwell closed the file and stared at the monitor, where Amara was now reading to his son, her own troubles set aside as she focused entirely on Ethan's needs. For 3 weeks straight, Amara arrived at Ethan's room at exactly 7:30 each morning. She noticed little things that weren't in his file, how his eyes followed birds outside the window, how his fingers twitched when certain songs played, how the corner of his mouth lifted slightly when she told jokes, even bad ones. You have a sense of humor hidden in there, she said one afternoon while helping him with his lunch. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. It can be our secret. In his downtown office, Maxwell Blackwood found himself watching the care room feeds more often. Before Amara, he'd check in sporadically, looking for problems to address. Now, he found himself drawn to these small interactions. The young woman spoke to Ethan as if her words were being heard and understood, not just filling silence. During a particularly important board meeting, Maxwell kept glancing at his phone where the care center feed played silently. His CFO was presenting quarterly projections, but Maxwell was distracted by Amara showing Ethan pictures from a science magazine, explaining each one as if teaching a class. Mr. Blackwood? The CFO asked, noticing his divided attention. Maxwell looked up. Continue. I'm listening. But his eyes drifted back to his phone, where his son's hand had moved, almost imperceptibly, toward the magazine page. The next day brought rain, and with it one of Ethan's bad days. Maxwell watched as his son refused breakfast, turning his head away from Amara's careful attempts. That's okay, she said, setting the spoon down. We all have tough mornings sometimes. Instead of forcing the issue, she pulled her chair closer. When I was little, rainy days made me sad too. My grandma used to tell me the clouds were just giving the flowers a drink. She began to hum softly while organizing his medications. The tune was gentle, something Maxwell didn't recognize. Slowly, Ethan's rigid posture relaxed. My grandma used to sing that, Amara explained, even though Ethan hadn't asked. She said it chases away the rain clouds inside us. Want to try breakfast again?" This time, Ethan allowed her to feed him. Maxwell found himself unconsciously leaning forward in his chair, watching this small victory unfold. That evening, when most staff had left, Maxwell noticed Amara was still there, though her shift had ended hours ago. She sat beside Ethan's bed, reading aloud from a physics book, changing her voice for different scientific theories as if they were characters in a story. Einstein would say, she began in a playfully serious voice, "That time is relative," which explains why my physics class felt like it lasted 3 years. Maxwell almost thought he saw Ethan smile. The next day, the facility director called Maxwell. "Mr. Blackwood, we have a staffing question. Ms. Johnson has declined reassignment to another resident. We generally rotate staff to prevent burnout, but she specifically requested to remain with Ethan. She's even refused a higher-paying position on our medical floor. I wanted to check if you have any objections." Maxwell thought about the previous caregivers, how quickly they'd burned out with Ethan. "Let her stay," he said simply. 2 nights later, Maxwell was working late when an alert flashed on his screen. The motion sensors in Ethan's room had activated, showing unusual movement. He quickly pulled up the feed. Ethan was having a seizure. Before Maxwell could call the facility, he saw Amara rush into the room. She must have been nearby, perhaps checking on another resident. With practiced movements, she gently turned Ethan on his side, speaking calmly the entire time. "You're okay, Ethan. I'm right here with you. Just breathe through it." Her voice remained steady, her hands sure as she made him comfortable and monitored his condition. She didn't call for help immediately. The file indicated Ethan had frequent mild seizures and hated the commotion of emergency response. Instead, she watched his breathing and eye movements carefully, clearly making a clinical assessment. Only when the seizure lasted longer than usual did she press the call button, still talking to Ethan the whole time. "I'm going to get Dr. Chen to come check on you, but I'm not leaving. I'll stay right here." Maxwell watched, his heart racing, as the medical team arrived. Throughout the episode, Amara stayed by Ethan's side, advocating for him when one nurse suggested a medication Ethan had previously had a bad reaction to. When it was over and Ethan was sleeping peacefully, Amara stayed. She pulled a textbook from her bag and began to study, looking up every few minutes to check on him. Maxwell sat back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: trust. For the first time since the accident, someone was caring for his son the way his wife would have. He wiped unexpected moisture from his eyes and closed the video feed. Tomorrow, he decided it was time to make some changes. She set up her phone to play the latest episode of Cosmic Questions and began the careful process of helping him eat. When Ethan struggled with swallowing, she waited patiently, never showing frustration. "It's okay, take your time," she encouraged. "My mom sometimes has trouble after her treatments too." For a moment, Ethan's eyes met hers, really met hers, before looking away. What Amara didn't know was that high above them, hidden in a recessed ceiling panel, a tiny camera captured every word, every gesture. 40 miles away, in a sleek downtown office tower, Maxwell Blackwood watched the feed on his private monitor. The tech billionaire had installed the system after catching a previous nurse roughly handling his son. Since then, Maxwell reviewed the footage obsessively, finding fault with every caregiver. His assistant had stopped scheduling interviews for the position, tired of Maxwell's impossible standards. But now, Maxwell leaned forward in his chair, watching this young woman speak to his son like a person, not a task. When Ethan refused a spoonful, instead of showing frustration, she simply waited, filling the silence with a story about her clinical rotation. For the first time in months, Maxwell saw his son take a full meal without resistance. He made a call. Find out everything about the new nurse. Everything. As Amara cleaned up after breakfast, completely unaware of the observation, she smiled at Ethan. "Same time tomorrow, okay." In his distant office, Maxwell Blackwood nodded slightly to himself. "Yes, same time tomorrow." The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Amara hurried to catch the bus. She checked her watch and sighed. Being late on her 3rd week wouldn't make a good impression, but her mom had needed help with her medication before Amara could leave their small apartment. At 19, Amara carried more responsibility than most people her age. Her nursing textbooks weighed heavy in her backpack, almost as heavy as the worry about next month's rent. Her mother's cancer treatments had drained their savings, and the part-time job at Oak Ridge Care Center was their lifeline. "Morning, Amara," called out Mrs. Patel from behind the reception desk as Amara rushed through the gleaming lobby. The care center looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility with its marble floors and expensive artwork. "Linda wants to see you before you start your shift." Amara's stomach tightened. Linda was the head nurse, known for her no-nonsense attitude. Had she noticed Amara staying past her shift to read to some of the residents? Was that against the rules? "You wanted to see me?" Amara asked, poking her head into Linda's office. Linda looked up from her computer. "Yes, we're changing your assignment starting today. You'll be caring for Ethan Blackwood in the private wing." Amara blinked in surprise. The private wing was reserved for the wealthiest patients. "But I've only been here 3 weeks. The last 3 nurses quit. The father is demanding." Linda handed her a thick folder. "Ethan is 17, neurodegenerative disorder, limited verbal skills, wheelchair-bound. His father pays triple our normal rates for consistent care." "I don't understand why you picked me then," Amara said honestly. "I'm the newest hire." Linda's expression softened slightly. "Because I've watched you with the residents. You have something that can't be taught." She checked her watch. "Room 117. Everything you need to know is in the file." 20 minutes later, Amara stood outside room 117, reading through Ethan's complex care requirements. The folder mentioned that his condition had worsened after a car accident 2 years ago, the same accident that had taken his mother's life. She knocked gently before entering. The room was unlike any other in the facility. It resembled a high-tech apartment with adaptive equipment seamlessly integrated into modern furnishings. Near the window sat a thin boy in a specialized wheelchair, staring outside. "Hello, Ethan. I'm Amara. I'll be helping you today," she said warmly, moving into his line of sight. Ethan's eyes, startlingly blue, flickered toward her briefly before returning to the window. According to his file, that small acknowledgement was more than he usually offered new caregivers. Amara noticed the bookshelves filled with science magazines and astronomy books. "You like space?" she asked, setting down her things. "My brother used to dream about being an astronaut." No response, but she hadn't expected one. As she prepared his morning medication, she told him about the astronomy course she'd taken before switching to nursing. She worked efficiently but unhurriedly, explaining what she was doing as she checked his vitals. "Time for breakfast," she announced, preparing the specialized feeding equipment. The file had noted feeding was particularly challenging. Ethan often refused to eat with new caregivers, leading to concerning weight loss. Amara pulled up a chair directly in front of him. "I heard you like those science podcasts. Want to listen to one while we eat?"